I don't want to be alone tonight, the female CEO whispered at 2:13 in the morning, and for one suspended second, the entire mood inside the Manhattan penthouse shifted into something dangerous, intimate, and impossible to misunderstand. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, freezing rain streaked across the glass like silver veins under the glow of midtown traffic, while 37 stories below, the city kept moving without mercy. Adrian Vale stood barefoot on the dark hardwood floor, one hand loosely holding the stem of a half-finished wine glass, the other pressed against the marble kitchen island as if it were the only thing keeping her upright. Her black evening gown still shimmered faintly beneath the dim pendant lights from the charity gala she had dominated only hours earlier, but now the confidence was gone. The cameras were gone. The applause was gone. And somehow, in the silence after midnight, the most powerful woman in her company suddenly looked exhausted enough to disappear. Caleb Mercer stood near the penthouse entrance holding his weathered leather jacket in one hand, broad shoulders still damp from the storm outside. He had driven Adrian home after her security detail abandoned the event to handle a media emergency downtown, and even now he looked uncomfortable being inside a place this expensive. The penthouse was larger than most houses he had worked on during his years in construction, all polished stone, quiet art, and expensive emptiness. He glanced once toward Adrian, then toward the elevator behind him. "Ma'am," he said carefully, "you've got 3 fireplaces, 12 rooms, and enough security downstairs to survive an alien invasion. I think you'll be okay." A weak laugh escaped her lips, but it faded quickly. "That's not really what I meant." Silence settled between them. The rain tapped softly against the windows. Somewhere in the distance, a siren echoed through the city before disappearing again. Caleb looked at her properly then, and for the first time that night, he noticed the loneliness hiding beneath the designer dress and diamond earrings. Not dramatic loneliness. Not theatrical sadness. The quiet kind. The kind that sat in expensive rooms long after everyone else left. Adrian swallowed hard and looked away first. "You know what the strange thing about power is?" she asked softly. Caleb waited. "Everyone stays close to you," she whispered. "But nobody stays for you." The words hung in the air heavier than either of them expected. Caleb shifted slightly, then reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and pulled out an old photograph. A little blonde girl with missing front teeth smiled back from the worn edges of the picture. His daughter, Lily. He stared at it for a second before slipping it back into his wallet. Then finally he looked at Adrian again. "Well," he said with a tired grin, "good news." She blinked. "What?" Caleb nodded toward the dark hallway behind her. "My daughter says haunted penthouses are safer when there's a witness around." Adrian froze for half a heartbeat before an unexpected laugh burst out of her chest, sudden and real and completely unpolished. It echoed through the giant apartment like warmth returning to a cold house. She covered her mouth, almost embarrassed by it, but Caleb only smiled faintly. Not flirtatious. Not smug. Just kind. And somehow that made the moment hit even harder. Because for the first time in years, Adrian Vale realized a man was standing in front of her, who wanted nothing from her at all. Not her money. Not her power. Not her loneliness. Just a place to sleep before the rain got worse. And somewhere beneath the sound of the storm outside, the mood inside the penthouse quietly changed forever. If this story has you hooked, take a second to subscribe. It really helps the channel. Also, are you Team CEO or Team Single Dad? Let me know in the comments. Now back to the story. Caleb Mercer slept on the couch like a man who had learned long ago how to rest anywhere without fully letting his guard down. The massive penthouse remained quiet except for the soft crackling of the gas fireplace, and the distant hiss of rain sliding down the windows overlooking Manhattan. Around 4:30 in the morning, Adrian Vale stepped silently into the living room wrapped in a cream-colored sweater that hung loosely over her shoulders, her makeup washed away, her hair falling naturally around her face for the first time all day. She paused when she saw him asleep beneath the folded gray blanket she had left for him hours earlier. One arm rested across his chest while the other hung slightly over the edge of the couch near his phone. The screen suddenly lit up with a photograph of a little girl smiling beside a crooked birthday cake, covered in too much pink frosting. Lily. The name glowed softly beneath the image as the phone vibrated with an incoming video call. Caleb woke instantly, not startled, just alert in the quiet way of someone used to responsibility. He grabbed the phone before the sound could echo through the apartment and sat upright, rubbing his eyes once before answering in a low voice. "Hey, Bug." Adrian stayed hidden near the hallway entrance without meaning to listen, but something about the softness in his voice rooted her there. A sleepy little face appeared on the screen wrapped in dinosaur pajamas and tangled blonde hair. "Daddy," Lily whispered dramatically. "I think Grandma burned the pancakes again." Caleb smiled immediately. Not the polite smile he used around strangers. A real one, warm enough to change his whole face. "That bad?" he asked. The smoke detector started crying. Caleb laughed quietly while Adrian watched from across the dark room, strangely caught off guard by how gentle he became around his daughter. Lily narrowed her eyes suspiciously through the screen. "Where are you?" Caleb glanced around the luxurious penthouse. "Long story. Are you at work?" "Sort of." "Why is it dark?" she asked. Caleb lowered his voice playfully. "Because I am hiding from rich people." Lily gasped dramatically. "Again." Adrian pressed her lips together, fighting a smile before she could stop it. Caleb noticed her standing there and gave a small nod of apology, but she simply shook her head softly as if to say continue. Lily leaned closer to the camera. "Did they make you wear one of those tiny fancy bow ties?" "Worse," Caleb whispered gravely. "They gave me sparkling water with cucumber in it." Lily burst into laughter so loud Caleb had to lower the volume. Quickly, even Adrian let out a quiet laugh under her breath. The sound surprised her more than anyone. Caleb eventually glanced toward the marble kitchen. "Did you brush your teeth?" Lily groaned instantly. "Dad, that is not a yes. I was emotionally preparing first." "Nice try." Lily crossed her arms. "You always ruin my legal arguments." Caleb grinned faintly. "That is because I was trained by professionals." The little girl finally smiled before yawning hard enough to nearly close her eyes. "Okay. Love you." Caleb's expression softened immediately. "Love you more." "Impossible." "Scientifically proven." She smiled sleepily one last time before the screen went dark. Silence settled gently across the penthouse afterward, but this time it no longer felt cold. Caleb placed the phone down carefully and stood. "Sorry if that woke you," he said quietly. Adrian stared at him for a moment longer than she intended. Then she shook her head once. "No," she whispered softly. "I think that might have been the first peaceful conversation I have heard in years." Caleb looked slightly uncomfortable with the honesty in her voice. He rubbed the back of his neck once and glanced toward the kitchen. "You hungry?" Adrian blinked. "At 5 in the morning? Best time for pancakes," he said calmly. "Especially the non-burning kind." And for reasons she could not explain yet, the loneliest woman in Manhattan suddenly followed him into the kitchen like the night had quietly stopped feeling so empty. By 7:15 that morning, the rain had finally stopped, but Manhattan still looked silver and exhausted beneath the cloudy sky. Inside the penthouse kitchen, the smell of butter and coffee lingered warmly in the air while Caleb Mercer stood at the stove wearing a plain dark t-shirt with the sleeves pushed slightly above his forearms. Adrian Vale sat quietly across from him at the marble island, one hand curled loosely around a coffee mug, as she watched him flip pancakes with calm concentration like he belonged there somehow. It made no sense to her. Men usually changed around her. They straightened their posture, deepened their voices, tried too hard to sound impressive or intelligent or important. Caleb did none of those things. He just cooked breakfast. "You keep looking at me like I am defusing a bomb," he said without turning around. Adrian blinked once before taking a sip of coffee. "I am trying to figure you out." Caleb slid a pancake onto a plate. "Bad investment." "You always answer serious questions with jokes?" she asked. "Only the expensive ones." Another smile threatened at the corner of her mouth. She hated how naturally he disarmed her. The kitchen fell quiet again except for the low hum of the refrigerator and the distant rumble of traffic 37 floors below them. Morning light filtered softly through the massive windows, washing pale gold across the marble countertops and making the penthouse feel less like a museum and more like a home for the first time in years. Caleb finally set a plate in front of her. "Careful," he warned. My daughter says these pancakes can heal emotional damage. Adrian looked down at the uneven stack. That is a bold claim. She is very committed to the family brand. Adrian laughed softly again, quieter this time, almost surprised by her own reaction. Then her phone buzzed sharply against the counter. The sound instantly changed the atmosphere. Caleb noticed it immediately. Adrienne's expression hardened as she glanced at the screen. One message, then another, then 5 more in rapid succession. Caleb looked away politely, but she had already seen the headlines. Late-night mystery man seen leaving CEO Adrian Vale's penthouse. Social media photographs filled the screen beneath the notifications. Grainy images of Caleb stepping from the building just before sunrise while security opened the car entrance downstairs. Another headline appeared seconds later. Billionaire CEO finally dating again? Adrian closed her eyes briefly. You have got to be kidding me. Caleb leaned lightly against the counter. That bad? She turned the screen toward him. He stared at the photos for a second before nodding once. Well, he said calmly, at least they caught my good side. Adrian looked at him in disbelief. Do you understand what this means? Probably means some guy named Trevor. Made $8,000 selling blurry pictures of me holding an umbrella. Caleb. Her tone sharpened slightly. This could become a problem at the company. Caleb's expression softened immediately. Then I will leave before anyone starts making your life harder. The words were simple. Honest. No guilt. No manipulation. Just quiet respect. And somehow that hit Adrian harder than the rumors themselves. Most people fought to stay close to power. Caleb's first instinct was to protect her from himself becoming a problem. The silence stretched between them again. Outside the windows, the city slowly brightened beneath the fading storm clouds while steam curled softly from untouched coffee cups. Adrian studied the tired man standing in her kitchen and realized something deeply unsettling. For the first time in years, she did not feel emotionally safer around wealth or status or control. She felt safer around kindness. Caleb reached for his jacket near the chair. Thank you for the couch, he said quietly, and the temporary shelter from your haunted skyscraper. Adrian looked at him for a long moment before speaking. Caleb. Yeah. She hesitated, something vulnerable flickering briefly across her face. What if I do not want you to leave yet? Caleb Mercer stopped halfway through putting on his jacket when Adrian asked him not to leave, and for a brief second neither of them moved. Morning light spilled softly through the towering windows of the penthouse, pale and cold against the dark marble floors, while somewhere far below the streets of Manhattan groaned back to life after the storm. Adrian immediately regretted how honest the question sounded. She was not used to asking people to stay. People usually asked her, needed her, wanted something from her. But Caleb simply looked at her quietly, his expression unreadable beneath the tired calm he seemed to carry everywhere. Adrian, he said carefully, you do realize your public relations team would probably tackle me off this floor if they heard that sentence. She let out a breath that almost sounded like a laugh. They already hate you. That fast. You were photographed existing near me. That is enough. Caleb slipped his jacket back over the chair instead of putting it on, and somehow that tiny decision changed the entire atmosphere inside the penthouse. Adrian noticed it instantly, not because it felt romantic, because it felt safe. The kind of safe she had not experienced in years. Caleb walked back toward the kitchen island and reached for the coffee pot. More coffee? He asked. Adrian nodded once. Please. He poured the coffee slowly while she studied him in silence. Strong hands. Steady posture. A man who looked like he had spent years carrying heavy things without complaining about the weight. Most people around Adrian moved with urgency because her world rewarded speed, ambition, performance. Caleb moved differently. Calmly. Deliberately. Like a man who no longer needed to prove his worth every 5 minutes. You always this quiet? She asked softly. Caleb handed her the mug. Only around billionaires and wild animals. Which one am I? Too early to tell. Adrian shook her head, smiling into the coffee before she could stop herself. Then the smile faded slowly as her eyes drifted toward the windows. The skyline stretched endlessly beyond the glass, silver towers disappearing into low clouds. Beautiful. Cold. Empty. Caleb noticed the shift immediately. Something wrong? He asked. Adrian stared at the city for several seconds before answering. Do you know how many people were in that ballroom last night? At least 4 men who looked emotionally attached to golf. A faint smile touched her lips again, but only briefly. 742, she whispered. 742 people in one room, and somehow I still came home feeling alone. Caleb said nothing at first. The quiet between them settled gently instead of awkwardly. That surprised her most of all. Most people rushed to fill silence because silence made them uncomfortable. Caleb seemed to understand it, respect it. Finally, he leaned lightly against the counter beside her. My wife used to say loneliness is strange, he said softly. Adrian glanced toward him immediately. It was the first time he had mentioned his wife. Caleb stared down into his coffee for a moment before continuing. She said you can survive being poor if somebody loves you, but being surrounded by everything and still feeling invisible. He shook his head faintly. That kind of lonely hit's different. Adrian felt something tighten unexpectedly in her chest. The penthouse suddenly seemed quieter than before. Even the hum of the city outside felt far away now. What happened to her? She asked gently. Caleb's jaw shifted once. Just once. Cancer, he answered simply. No dramatic pause. No performance. Just truth. Adrian lowered her eyes immediately, suddenly understanding something about the sadness hidden beneath his calm. Caleb took another sip of coffee before speaking again. After she passed, everybody kept telling me to stay strong. He smiled faintly, though there was no humor in it. Nobody tells you how tired strong people get. The words landed softly between them, but Adrian felt them harder than almost anything she had heard in years. Because standing in the middle of that enormous penthouse beside a man who understood grief without turning it into a spectacle, she realized something deeply unsettling. For the first time in a very long time, she no longer felt alone inside her own life. The first sign that the rumors were becoming a problem came just after 9:05 that morning when Adrian Vale's assistant called 3 times in under 60 seconds. The penthouse, which had briefly felt warm and human over coffee and pancakes, suddenly shifted back toward the sharp polished world Adrian usually lived in. Her phone buzzed nonstop across the marble counter, while news alerts stacked one after another across the screen. Investors concerned over CEO controversy. Mystery man identified leaving Vale residence. Social media speculation explodes overnight. Caleb stood quietly near the sink rinsing dishes as if the headlines belonged to somebody else entirely. You do not have to clean those, Adrian said distractedly while scrolling through messages. I made the pancakes, Caleb replied calmly. That legally makes this my mess. Under different circumstances she would have smiled, but tension had already settled heavily across her shoulders. Caleb noticed it immediately. Board meeting, he asked. Adrian nodded once without looking up. Emergency conference call in 40 minutes. Over photographs? She gave a tired laugh with no humor in it. Welcome to corporate America. Caleb dried his hands slowly on a kitchen towel before leaning lightly against the counter. Then maybe they need a better hobby. Adrian finally looked up at him. You really are not bothered by any of this, are you? Caleb shrugged slightly. People talked when I became a single father at 32. People talked when I stopped taking higher-paying jobs to stay home more with Lily. People talked when I turned down promotions because I wanted to eat dinner with my daughter instead of living in airports. He gave a faint smile. Eventually you realize opinions are loudest when people do not understand your priorities. The words settled deeply into the quiet kitchen. Adrian stared at him for a moment, realizing he carried his dignity differently than most men she knew. Quietly. Without performance. Without bitterness. Suddenly another call flashed across her screen. This time her expression visibly hardened. Caleb could tell immediately whoever was calling mattered. You should probably take that, he said gently. Adrian inhaled once before answering. Martin. Even through the phone Caleb could hear the sharp frustration of the older man's voice. Chairman Martin Pierce. Head of the board. Tell me this nonsense is already handled, the voice snapped. Adrian straightened automatically, slipping back into CEO posture. Calm. Controlled. Untouchable. It is under control. The investors are asking questions. The press is circling. We cannot have distractions right now. Caleb turned away respectfully and reached for his jacket near the chair, quietly giving her privacy. I said it is under control, Adrian repeated firmly. There was a pause before Martin's tone sharpened again. Then remove the distraction. The line went silent afterward. Adrian lowered the phone slowly while the city hummed faintly beyond the windows. Caleb already understood. He slipped one arm into his jacket. You do not have to explain. Adrian looked up immediately. That is not what I meant. Maybe not, Caleb said softly. But he did. The quiet honesty in his voice hurt more than anger would have. He reached for his car keys from the counter. You should focus on your meeting. Adrian stepped toward him instinctively. Caleb. He paused near the doorway. Morning light cut across the penthouse behind him while distant thunder still rolled softly somewhere beyond the skyline. You know what the funny thing is? Adrian asked quietly. Caleb turned slightly. Her voice lowered. Vulnerable again. Everybody in my world keeps telling me what is good for my image. She swallowed once. But you are the first thing in years that has actually felt good for me. The words hung in the air between them. Raw. Honest. Dangerous in a completely different way than either of them expected. Caleb looked at her for several seconds without speaking. Then finally he smiled that small tired smile again. Adrian, he said gently, you are looking at a guy whose daughter once cut her own bangs with safety scissors. He slid his keys into his pocket. Trust me, I am not qualified to ruin a billionaire. Adrian laughed despite herself, the tension breaking just enough for air to return to the room. But as Caleb walked toward the elevator and the penthouse slowly grew quiet again, she realized something that unsettled her deeply. She did not want the calm to leave with him. By 6:30 that evening, the storm had returned to Manhattan in cold sheets of rain that blurred the skyline into silver and charcoal beyond the towering glass windows of Vail Technologies headquarters. The top executive floor buzzed with tension as assistants hurried through hallways carrying tablets and coffee, while television screens silently replayed the morning headlines about Adrian Vail and the mystery man seen leaving her penthouse. Inside the boardroom, the atmosphere felt sharper than the weather outside. Adrian sat at the far end of the long black conference table wearing a fitted cream blazer over a dark silk blouse, her posture perfectly composed despite the exhaustion pressing behind her eyes. Across from her, 6 board members shuffled papers and exchanged carefully measured looks that barely concealed judgment. Chairman Martin Pierce adjusted his glasses before speaking first. The investors are nervous, he said flatly. Public perception matters. Adrian folded her hands calmly. Public perception is not the same thing as leadership. Perhaps not, Martin replied. But perception controls stock value. The room fell quiet except for the faint hum of the city beyond the rain-streaked windows. Another board member leaned forward. With respect, Adrian, people are asking who this man is. She did not blink. A private citizen. A driver. Someone else added carefully. A maintenance contractor? Adrienne's jaw tightened slightly. A human being, she answered coldly. Silence followed. Not because of the words themselves, but because nobody in that room was used to hearing compassion spoken with authority. Martin exhaled slowly and slid a tablet across the table toward her. This photograph has already crossed 12 million views online. Adrian glanced down briefly at the image of Caleb Mercer stepping into the rain outside her building that morning, his jacket pulled tight against the storm. Somehow, even through grainy photography, he still looked calm, grounded, real. Then perhaps the internet should congratulate him for surviving my pancakes, she said dryly. A few uneasy smiles flickered around the room, but Martin did not laugh. This is serious. Adrian looked directly at him. No, she said quietly. A single father trying to raise his daughter while working 2 jobs is serious. This is gossip. The room stiffened instantly. Martin's expression darkened. You are getting emotionally involved. Adrian almost responded immediately, but stopped herself, because the uncomfortable truth was that he was right. Hours earlier, Caleb Mercer had simply been a kind man caught in the wrong photograph. Now she could not stop thinking about him, about the way he made coffee, the way he spoke to his daughter, the way he listened without trying to control the silence. Her phone buzzed softly beside her. A text message. Unknown number. Adrian frowned, slightly before opening it beneath the table. Hope your board survives. Also, your coffee machine makes terrifying noises. Caleb. Against all logic, warmth touched her chest instantly. Another message followed seconds later. Lily says rich people probably do not know this, but dinner fixes most bad days. Adrian stared at the screen longer than she meant to. A third message appeared. Also, she wants you to know pancakes are still available if morale drops below acceptable levels. Before Adrian could stop herself, she laughed softly under her breath. Small. Genuine. Human. Every head in the boardroom slowly turned toward her in confusion. Martin narrowed his eyes. Something amusing? Adrian looked down once more at the message before locking the screen calmly. Then she leaned back in her chair with the first real smile anyone in that room had seen from her in months. Actually, she said softly, yes. Outside, the rain hammered harder against the glass while thunder rolled low across the city. But for the first time all day, the tension inside Adrian Vale's chest loosened slightly. Because somewhere beyond the headlines and boardrooms and billion-dollar expectations, a tired single father with a broken coffee maker and a little girl who believed pancakes healed sadness had somehow managed to make the most powerful woman in Manhattan feel emotionally safe again. The rain had finally stopped by the time Adrian Vale stepped out of the black company sedan just after 8 that night, but Manhattan still glistened beneath the streetlights like the city itself had been washed raw. The board meeting had stretched for hours, leaving her exhausted in the sharp, invisible way only corporate warfare could manage. Cameras still lingered outside the building entrance hoping for another photograph, another rumor, another headline, but Adrian ignored them completely as she crossed the sidewalk in high heels that clicked sharply against the wet pavement. Her driver pulled away while cold wind drifted between the buildings carrying the smell of rain and traffic and late-night food carts. Normally she would have gone straight upstairs to her empty penthouse and another silent dinner eaten alone beside glowing city lights. But tonight something tugged at her differently. 10 minutes later, Adrian stood outside a small neighborhood diner tucked between a laundromat and an old bookstore on the Upper West Side. The neon sign buzzed faintly overhead while warm yellow light spilled across the sidewalk. Mercer Family Dinner Night. The handwritten chalkboard near the entrance read beside a crooked drawing of pancakes clearly made by a child. Adrian stared at it for a moment before stepping inside. The diner smelled like coffee, syrup, grilled onions, and comfort. Real comfort. Not the polished artificial kind sold in luxury hotels. A handful of customers sat scattered through the booths while an old country song played softly from the speakers overhead. Near the back corner booth, Caleb Mercer sat beside Lily wearing a faded gray Henley and jeans, looking more relaxed than she had ever seen him. Lily immediately spotted Adrian first. "Fancy lady!" she shouted excitedly, nearly knocking over her chocolate milk. Several customers turned. Caleb closed his eyes briefly. "Lily," he muttered. "What?" "That is what Grandma called her." Adrian laughed softly before approaching the booth. Caleb stood automatically out of politeness. "You found us." "Your daughter mentioned dinner heals emotional damage," Adrian replied. "I came for medical treatment." Lily gasped dramatically. "Dad, I told you pancakes were science." Caleb shook his head while sliding out of the booth slightly so Adrian could sit across from them. The warmth of the diner wrapped around her almost instantly. No board members. No headlines. No billion-dollar expectations. Just the soft clatter of dishes and the smell of coffee and a tired single father trying his best to raise a little girl with kindness. Lily leaned across the table conspiratorially. "Did rich people finally stop yelling at you?" Caleb nearly choked on his coffee. "Lily." "What?" She looked stressed on television. Adrian blinked. "I was on television?" "Grandma watches business news like football," Lily explained seriously. Caleb rubbed his forehead. "I am never surviving parenthood." Adrian smiled into her coffee cup while Caleb watched her carefully from across the booth. She looked different tonight. Softer somehow. Less guarded. Less alone. A waitress eventually arrived carrying fresh pancakes stacked high with butter melting slowly over the top. Lily pointed proudly. "Dad made those." Adrian raised an eyebrow. "You work here too?" Caleb shrugged slightly. "Only weekends." "You have 3 jobs?" For if you count removing glitter from homework projects. Lily nodded solemnly. That one is dangerous. Adrian laughed again, this time freely enough that nearby customers glanced toward her with quiet curiosity. Caleb noticed something then that made his chest tighten unexpectedly. For the first time since he had met Adrienne Vale, she no longer looked like a billionaire CEO sitting in a diner. She looked like a woman finally exhaling after carrying too much weight for too long. Then Lily tilted her head curiously toward Adrian. Can I ask you something? Sure. Why do you always look sad even when you smile? The question landed gently but honestly, the way only children could manage. The entire booth fell quiet. Caleb immediately stepped in. Hey, Bug. No, Adrian whispered softly before he could rescue her from the question. She looked down at the steaming coffee between her hands for a moment while the diner hummed quietly around them. Then finally she answered with painful honesty. Because sometimes grown-ups get so busy being strong that they forget how to feel happy. Lily considered that very seriously before reaching across the table and placing one syrup-sticky hand over Adrienne's wrist. That sounds really tiring. Silence settled softly around the booth afterward. Not awkward. Not dramatic. Just human. And somewhere in the middle of that tiny diner beneath flickering neon lights and the smell of pancakes, Adrienne Vale felt something inside her begin to heal that money had never once been able to touch. By the time the diner finally emptied out that night, the city outside had settled into the deep quiet rhythm that only happened after midnight in Manhattan. Rainwater still shimmered along the sidewalks beneath streetlights while distant taxi horns echoed softly between buildings like tired music. Inside the diner, the neon sign buzzed faintly against the window as Caleb Mercer wiped down the last booth with slow, steady movements. Lily had fallen asleep 20 minutes earlier in the corner booth beneath Caleb's old denim jacket, one cheek pressed against a coloring book covered in crooked stars and pancake drawings. Adrienne Vale sat nearby holding a warm coffee mug between both hands, watching the scene with a kind of stillness she had not felt in years. No cameras. No shareholders. No pretending. Just soft country music, tired fluorescent lights, and the quiet dignity of ordinary people trying to survive the world gently. Caleb glanced toward his sleeping daughter and lowered his voice. She fought sleep like it was personal tonight. Adrian smiled faintly. She gets that from you? Caleb leaned against the counter. No. I gave up fighting life years ago. The answer surprised her. Not because it sounded sad. Because it sounded peaceful. Caleb eventually stepped closer to the booth and sat across from her, while the dishwasher hummed softly in the kitchen behind them. For a moment neither spoke. The silence between them had become something different now. Comfortable. Honest. Dangerous in the quietest possible way. Adrian traced one finger slowly around the rim of her coffee cup before finally speaking. Can I ask you something? Caleb nodded once. Why are you not afraid of me? He blinked slightly. What? Most people are, she admitted softly. Or they want something. Or they become someone else around me. She looked down briefly. You never do. Caleb studied her face for a second beneath the warm diner lights. Without the corporate armor and perfect posture, she looked younger somehow. Not weaker. Just tired of carrying everything alone. He leaned back slightly in the booth. Adrian, he said calmly. I survived the Marines, raising a 6-year-old during a glitter phase, and one Thanksgiving with my mother-in-law after she discovered online politics. A faint grin touched his mouth. Trust me. You rank third. For half a second Adrian simply stared at him. Then the laugh hit her all at once. Real laughter. Sudden enough that she had to cover her mouth to keep from waking Lily. Tears immediately gathered in the corners of her eyes as she shook her head. That is not funny, she whispered while laughing harder anyway. Caleb smiled softly. My daughter says humor is cheaper than therapy. Adrian tried to stop laughing, but something inside her cracked open instead. Months of pressure. Years of loneliness. Endless nights pretending strength was the same thing as happiness. The laughter slowly dissolved into quiet tears she clearly had not planned to let anyone see. Caleb's smile faded instantly into concern. Hey, he said gently. Adrian shook her head quickly, embarrassed. I am sorry. Do not apologize. She wiped at her eyes with trembling fingers and looked away toward the dark windows of the diner. I think I forgot what it felt like, she whispered. Caleb's voice lowered. What? Adrian swallowed hard before answering. To laugh without needing to impress anybody. Silence settled softly between them afterward while the old neon sign reflected dimly across the glass. Caleb did not rush to comfort her. Did not flirt. Did not try to turn vulnerability into romance. He simply stayed there beside her in the quiet. Present. Steady. Safe. And somehow that made the moment hit even harder. Adrian looked at him again after a long silence, her eyes still damp beneath the soft diner lights. You know what scares me? She asked quietly. Caleb waited. Her voice dropped almost to a whisper. I think my favorite part of today was not the boardroom or the headlines or the money. She glanced toward sleeping Lily beneath the oversized denim jacket, then back at Caleb. I think it was sitting in this tiny diner watching a tired father make pancakes like it mattered. Caleb looked down briefly, almost humbled by the honesty in her voice. Then he smiled faintly. To Lily, he said softly, pancakes always matter. Adrian laughed through the last of her tears while somewhere outside the city kept moving through the darkness, completely unaware that inside a little diner glowing beneath tired neon lights, two lonely people had quietly stopped feeling invisible. 3 months later, the first snow of December drifted quietly across Manhattan like the city itself had finally decided to slow down. The skyline beyond Adrian Vale's penthouse windows glowed softly beneath the evening lights while inside, warmth lived where silence used to. The marble kitchen no longer looked untouched and perfect. A tiny pair of glitter-covered sneakers sat crooked near the doorway beside Caleb Mercer's worn work boots. A child's drawing of pancakes taped unevenly to the refrigerator read official healing breakfast in bright purple marker. Somewhere down the hallway, Lily's laughter echoed through the apartment, followed by the sound of Caleb pretending to lose an argument on purpose. Absolutely not, he said dramatically. There is no legal evidence proving bedtime exists. Dad, Lily shouted through laughter. You made the rules. That sounds like something a corrupt government would say. Adrian stood quietly near the kitchen island, holding a mug of tea between her hands while watching them from a distance. Caleb sat cross-legged on the living room rug wearing an old navy sweatshirt while Lily climbed onto his back pretending he was a horse despite the fact he looked exhausted from working all day. Snow drifted softly beyond the giant windows while Christmas lights reflected warmly across the glass. The penthouse still overlooked all of Manhattan. Still expensive, still powerful, still impossibly elegant. But now it finally felt lived in. Human. Safe. Caleb eventually caught Adrian watching them and smiled faintly. You are staring again. Adrian tilted her head innocently. I am evaluating management performance. And morale appears suspiciously high. Lily immediately pointed toward Adrian from across the room. That is because Dad makes hot chocolate with tiny marshmallows now. Caleb looked offended. That was classified information. Adrian laughed softly before walking toward them. Even now the sound surprised her sometimes. Not because she laughed rarely anymore. Because it came naturally now. Caleb leaned back against the couch while Lily curled sleepily against his shoulder, her energy finally fading after an hour of decorating paper snowflakes across the penthouse windows. The room settled into quiet warmth broken only by soft jazz music playing from the speakers and the gentle hum of the fireplace. Adrian sat beside Caleb on the couch and looked out across the snowy skyline. You know, she said quietly, this place used to feel enormous. Caleb glanced around the penthouse. It still does. She smiled faintly. No. Before it felt empty. Lily yawned heavily against Caleb's shoulder without opening her eyes. Now it smells like pancakes and crayons, she mumbled sleepily. Caleb kissed the top of her head gently. High-end luxury. Adrian looked at him then. Really looked at him. The tired single father who fixed broken coffee machines, worked too many jobs, folded laundry badly, and somehow carried more quiet dignity than every powerful man she had ever known combined. He noticed her staring and smiled softly. What? Adrian hesitated for a second before answering honestly. I spent years building a life people would envy. Her voice lowered gently beneath the crackling firelight. And somehow the happiest I have ever been is sitting on a couch beside a man who thinks pancakes are emotional support. Caleb laughed quietly beneath his breath. To be fair, they have an excellent success rate. Adrian shook her head, smiling through eyes suddenly damp with emotion again. But this time the tears felt different. Not lonely, not exhausted, just grateful. Caleb studied her face for a moment before reaching over carefully and taking her hand in his. No dramatic music. No grand speech. Just warmth. Steady and quiet and real. Adrian squeezed his hand gently while snow continued falling beyond the windows of the city she once ruled but no longer needed to conquer alone. Because somewhere between a stormy night, a broken coffee machine, and a little diner filled with pancake jokes, the loneliest woman in Manhattan had discovered something money could never buy. Peace. And beside her, Caleb Mercer smiled softly as Lily slept against his shoulder, and the giant penthouse finally stopped feeling haunted. Thank you for being here until the very end. Your support truly means a lot to this channel. Before you leave, tell us, are you watching as a husband, wife, mom, dad? Or just someone who enjoys stories like this? Share your answer in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this video, please subscribe for more stories every week.